anatomy of a design. I picked a few designs, and I think number one, what we want to talk about is when you first bring artwork up onto the screen, and the way that you look at a design. Look, folks, for years I've been asked, when you first bring a design up on the screen, how do you decide, number one, what do you do first, what do you do second? So you know what, let's just go ahead and bring up, I'm just going to go ahead and I'll bring up this design right here, okay? Look, when you first bring a design up on the screen, I'm going to go ahead and size this also. First of all, the first rule in creating an embroidery design when you first bring it up on the screen in anatomy of a design is you size the design. When you first bring a design up onto your screen, no matter what type of artwork it is, you've always got to size the design. Why? Only when you're working on the finished size of an embroidery design will you be able to determine the proper stitch type to utilize. So I'm going to go ahead and size this design. We're going to go ahead and size this design about 5 inches or so. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. Now, one of the great things about Floriani software is that when you bring a design up on the screen, simply grab your ruler at this point and measure the aspect or measure the element of the design. When you measure within Floriani software, it's going to tell you exactly what stitch type to utilize. All right? Now, when you first decide what stitch type you want to utilize, or excuse me, what element you want to do in a design first. First of all, let me talk about first of all dimensional embroidery. Dimensional embroidery works its way like this, folks. The stitch type in an embroidery design creates the effect. The stitch direction creates the dimension. So, in looking at a design like this, and again, we're looking at a very simple design where when I measure across it in this direction, it's telling me, well, use a fill stitch there. When I measure across this in this direction, it's telling me use a satin stitch. So width does indeed determine stitch type, but initially right now I'm talking about effect. Now, when I think about fire, and one of the things I learned from my son many, many years ago is that if you color your artwork, 99% of the time when you color your artwork, the direction your pencil goes, and in my book I have an entire chapter based on this. It's called Just Like Coloring with Pencils, okay? Print your design out. When you first bring a design up on the screen, what my suggestion is that you print the design out on a piece of paper, certainly. Then get yourself some colored pencils. When you color a design, you know what? 99% of the time when you color a design, the direction your pencil is drawing is the direction you want to take your stitches. So when I think of fire, fire goes up and down. So the stitch direction and what stitch type I'm going to utilize in this design is I'm going to run my stitches straight up and down. So when I measure in this direction, it's telling me to use a fill stitch. Now, within Floriani software, under Tools and General Options, you have a choice in digitizing of a standard or a complex. Let me explain the difference. A standard digitizing, you basically are allowing the software to determine start point, end point, and stitch direction. You'll see I've set a default angle here at 0 degrees. Well, you know what? In this case, I'm going to go ahead and choose advanced digitizing. Why? Because I want to be in control of my start point, end point, and stitch direction of this design. So I've chosen advanced level of digitizing in the fill stitch. And the first stitch that I'm going to start with is I'll go ahead and start with this color, this lighter tan right here. I'm going to grab my fill stitch right here. I'm going to go ahead and at this point grab the magic wand. I'm going to come down here, and right now, you know what, I'll just go ahead and pick yellow, and I'm going to left click on this. Now, it's asking me stitch direction. My stitch direction currently is going 90 degrees. Look, that's the direction I want. Why? Because I see fire is going up. If I were to draw it with a pencil, it would be going top to bottom. Now, let me explain something. With a fill stitch, when you digitize a fill stitch, it's best in most cases, and now I'm going to talk start and end point. So number one, I'm going to simply right click. That's going to give me the stitch direction of that 90 degrees. Now it's going to ask me start point. Well, you know what? I'm going to put the start point over here on the very far right of this design, and I'm going to put the end point over here on the very extreme left. Okay? and it's going to go ahead and it's going to digitize this. Now, why did I choose start point and end point? Let me explain something with a fill. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and right now come under Tools, General Options, and I'm going to go back just into Standard Digitizing. And I want to explain something about fill stitching. And it's a very important aspect. Start and end points, folks. I'm going to go ahead and just do it, just digitize a fill stitch. But start and end points on a fill stitch are a very important aspect to fill stitching. Now, my fill stitching here, I set a standard direction at 0. If I come in and select that fill stitch, and I come in and ask shape, when you ask shape, it's now going to show you start point and end point. Start points are always green, end points are always red. Well, you're going to see the start point right here in the green, you're going to see the end point. So if I now come into view in a slow redraw, you're going to see that when I redraw this design, we'll go ahead and let it finish that first aspect. Let's go ahead and let it jump into the second element. And you'll see the underlay now running. But the issue with start point and end points, and then this is a very, very important aspect to anatomy of a design and to how one digitizes the fill stitch. Started over here, did the underlay. Now it's going to stitch down this fill direction to here. But you know what? Once it reaches this point here, it's going to come down here to this bottom element on the right, and it's going to stitch back up. Let me explain something with a fill stitch. This is a detriment to fill stitch. Let me explain. When the fill stitch is moving in this direction, it's moving the material in that direction. When I now come up in this direction and start to move up in this direction, I'm actually pushing the material. The push is not only effect of stitches building upon stitches, density building upon density, which, like let's say in the case of a letter I, causes it to be taller. In this case, I'm physically pushing the material. And many of you, I'm sure you've seen when you run a fill stitch, have seen a piece of material pop out right here. So if I allow this to continue to run, I'm actually now pushing the material, especially a knit-based material, into the face of each other. Going to come right up to here. I probably now have a piece of material right up here. I'm now pushing this piece of material or the same material up to this direction where this stitch ends right here. Well, you know what? I'll go ahead and complete this entirely. If I come in and select this, I'm going to do two things. Oops, excuse me. I'm going to do two things with a design like this. Number one, I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to change my stitch direction to a 90 degrees, so it's going straight up and down. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the start point over to here. I'm going to grab the end point, and I'm going to move the end point over to the farthest point away from that start point. What I'm trying to do is I want to drive the fill in a continuous direction over to the end point. And if I right-click and let it go ahead and regenerate, if you watch me now slow redraw, and we'll come in and we'll do that. First of all, I'll pull through this one right here, let that one get done, okay? And we'll start it right there. What you're going to see now is the fill stitch moving in a consistent forward direction, okay? Number one, dimensional embroidery. Stitch type creates the effect. Stitch type creates the effect. Stitch type or stitch direction creates the dimension. So again, here, in the fill stitch of this fire, the stitch direction is creating the dimension. The stitch type is creating the effect of a fire, okay? Fire goes up. Now, because I put the start point here and the end point here, everything is a forward-moving fill stitch. I'm pushing the material in the same forward direction. That is a benefit. In fact, with fill stitching, and let me make this very, very clear, 99% of the time when I'm creating a fill stitch or when I lay a fill stitch, that fill stitch is going to go straight left to right or straight up and down, 0 or 90 degrees. When you stitch a fill stitch in the direction or in, let's say, a 45-degree angle, you're stitching in the direction of the bias of the material, and you literally will simply twist that fill stitch, or you will twist that base material. 99% of the time, when you stitch a fill stitch, go 90 degrees or 0 degrees. It is such an important aspect. Otherwise, you will twist that material. Now, saying that, if you use certainly a fusible-based stabilizer, if you use a fusible stitch and wash, if you use heat and stay, if you use one of our fusible stabilizers, you will inhibit. You will minimize that twist. But when you stitch in the direction of the bias, especially with a fill stitch, you're going to twist that material. 99% of the time, I swear, when I've corrected people's designs, all I do is simply change the direction of that fill stitch. Now, having said that, I've got this stitch going straight up and down. Once again, I'll grab my fill stitch. I'll grab the magic wand. I'll go ahead and grab the same color. Once again, I'll left click on that. It's now asking me direction. I'm at 90 degrees again. Right click. Where am I? Excuse me. I went back into standard. I'm going to undo that. My apologies. I'm going to go back into advanced digitizing on the fill stitch. I'm going to left click on that. Give me stitch direction, 90 degrees. Right click. Where do I want my start point? I want my start point right here. Where do I want my end point? I want my end point right here. Okay? It's done. Once again, I'm going to come in here. I'm going to left click on that. Where do I want my start point? You know what? Stitch direction again. Right click. Stitch direction is now that 90 degrees. Start point over here on the far right. End point over here on the far left. I just made it a forward generating stitch. Now I'm going to come in. We'll go ahead and change color. We'll go ahead and right click, change to the orange. Once again, come in here. Left click. I've got my 90 degrees. Right click. Where do I want my start point? I'm going to put my start point over here on the far left. End point over here on the very far right. Where am I going to come in this one? Let's come in here and put, once again, left click. Stitch direction is 90 degrees. Right click. Start point right over here. End point right over here. That one's done. Come into here. Left click. Stitch direction 90 degrees. Right click. Start point over here on the far right. End point over here on the far left. I'll generate these when we're done. Let's come over to here. What am I going to do now? Left click. Right click 90 degrees. Start point over here on the far left. End point over here, or excuse me, on the far right. End point on the far left. That one's done. Once again, come in here. 90 degrees. Right click. Start point over here on the very far right. End point over here on the very far left. That's done. The rest is going to be satin stitching. Grab your satin stitching once again. Now, in coming in and doing the sticks on here, I see satin stitching. I want it stitching up and down. We're in standard mode, but standard mode is going to look at the narrowest direction in order to determine stitch direction. So once again, I've clicked on my satin stitch. Magic wand is already determined. Come in here, right click on the color brown. Let's go ahead and take care of this brown. Left click, right click. Now with satin stitching, start point, end point is not as important as with the fill stitch. Let's come in and grab my red color now. We have a left click and a right click, left click and a right click. We've got one more color. Let's go ahead and turn that into black. When you want to change the color with Floriani software, simply left click on, let's say the color purple down there. I want black. Left click on black. OK. Left click, right click, that element's done. Left click, right click, that's done. Left click, right click, that's done. Now it didn't change color, so you know what? Let's go ahead and grab those elements. I want that to be black. Right click. Let's go ahead and grab this element. We wanted it black. Right click turns it into black. That one, right click, let's turn it into black. You know what? That design's done now, but let me explain something. Not only have we created, it's a simple design, there is no doubt, but we now have a very dimensional design. And if you watch it in a slow redraw, you'll see, and we'll slow it down the whole way, all of our fills, and we drove the fills into here, have started on the far side, and it's all a progressive forward-moving fill. You'll see when it moves to here, it comes back and moves forward. Done. Underlay here. Progressive forward-moving fill stitch throughout the entire design. Comes back, moves forward. See how it comes back up to here now? Progressive forward-moving fill stitch. So, again, for dimensional embroidery, stitch type creates the effect. Stitch direction creates the dimension, but The biggest lesson in this aspect of this design right here is start points and end points, especially with your fills, and the direction that it moves one's material as one stitches. And as you see now, everything is in a forward-moving direction. That's a total benefit to the embroidery process. Absolutely a total benefit to the embroidery process. And we'll see that it continues in a forward motion. Stitch type creates dimension. Stitch direction, or excuse me, stitch type creates effect. Stitch direction creates dimension. And you'll see here once again in a complex direction of a fill stitch. I can't stress how much of an important aspect this is to the embroidery creation. Now, a few stitches back, it's not going to have a big bearing. We're only talking about 2 or 3 lines of stitching. But when you're talking about a success of 50, 60 lines of stitching, you're going to see that material push right back into each other. So with that said, what I'm going to do is bring up a series of designs, fairly complex designs, and talk about how we determine, again, start point, end point, how we look at a design, how we view a design. But initially, I wanted to talk about dimensional embroidery, start points, and end points within a design. So you know what, Kath, at this point in time, I'm going to throw it over to you for a couple of questions, if some questions have come through, and then I'll bring up a series of considerably more complex designs.
Okay, well, the first question is, and they're asking, how do they find your book, and what is the name of it?
My book is called Destined to Digitize, and the best way to contact me regarding that is to email me at walt@rnkdistributing.com, and I will be in touch with you personally regarding my book. And for people who own the software, which is who everyone is on here, I will make sure that you get extra special care taken care of. I will also share with you all that I'm working on right now a series of videos that are based on my book and based on our software, where my book is written in a more generic manner for all software. No matter what you digitize on, my videos will be very specific to Floriani software.
Well, and speaking of videos, I have a question on if they've downloaded all the videos into their embroidery suite, how do they view them?
How do they view them? You view the videos, and I don't have them currently all downloaded within my software right now. But if you click on the how-to video tutorials, here in Walt's Corner, you're going to see my lessons. Example, when I talk about like that complex fill, and I talk about start end points, click on it. And you'll hear my rough, gravelly voice, "Hi, everyone, this is Walt." And it will talk to you about the fill stitch. Now, beyond that, we do answer a certain amount of questions that come over technical through the forum, through a series of videos. New videos, not only downloaded initially into Walt's Corner, can be found here in the bottom area. If you go to Walter's Corner right here, you will see an area of new videos that come up. These are videos now downloaded into the system. I'll also share with you all, and I'll go ahead and close this, that there is a series of other videos, if you go into the My Floriani Today area, called Lessons from the Masters videos. And this is another series of videos that have been uploaded onto the site.
That's great.
Of other videos right here. So there's several different areas you can find videos. In Walt's Corner, you're going to find the videos answered through the support forum. There's over 5 hours of videos downloaded into the software initially. And then in the Lessons from the Masters videos, you're going to find some more specific videos having to do just with embroidery, not necessarily having to do with the software specifically, Kathy.
Walter, also try and keep your mic where it's close to you because you're kind of fading in and out. And
I'm so sorry. Is that better?
That is better. So stay with the mic. Thank you.
I absolutely apologize.
No problem. Okay, it's time to move on.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and bring up a fairly complex design. And this is a very famous design. for me, and it's my Columbine logo. Now, let's talk about how one looks at a design and how one determines how a design is digitized. Again, dimensional embroidery, stitch type creates effect, stitch direction creates dimension. Now, first of all, let me explain something. When this design was created, this was a design created during the Columbine tragedy, and it was a design that I had downloaded on or put up on my website and asked anyone who downloaded it to stitch it on a garment and send it to Little Colorado. Well, a very long story made very short. 8,000 downloads had taken place. Over 6,000 garments were sent to Little Colorado. But the more important aspect of this design is, and here's a very, very a very clear response as to how one digitizes a design and, again, creating a specific effect. Number one, when you look at an embroidered design as you digitize it, the basic way that I teach people is to look at things in a dimensional aspect as far as what's farthest away. So when I look at a design like this, what do I see farthest away? The first thing that I see is I see the sky. So the first thing that I'm going to digitize in a design like this, I'm going to digitize the sky. Why? Because it's the thing that I see the farthest back. What do I see then on top of that sky? I see the rays of sun emanating up from behind those mountains, shooting up into the sky. Once again, in this case, the fill stitch going left to right creates the effect. Direction creates the dimension, flat sky. Then in the rays of the sun, stitch type, running stitch, stitch direction, going at different angles, create the effect of the illumination of the sun going up towards the sky. What do I see next in this design? I see the mountains, certainly on top of that background sky. So I stitch the mountains would then be next. What do I see next in this design? I see the snow-capped peaks. Now, if you look at the snow-capped peaks, many times in an effect like this, I would use a fill stitch. What I used was an elongated satin stitch that actually shaped the peaks of the snow as doves flying towards heaven. So I formed the wings of the dove, or in this case, the snow-capped peaks, with elongated satin stitching going in the direction that I wanted the birds to fly up towards heaven. What would I see next? I would then see the outlining on there, finalizing that background. What would I then see next in a design like this? I see the satin stitch border that surrounds that entire design. What do I see next in this design? I see the leaves of the flower. Now, once again, three-dimensional embroidery, I see the leaves emanating in direction. Once again, if you took the pencil and you colored a design like this, this is actually how you would color it. You'd probably color that background left to right. You'd color those rays up and down in the direction you saw those rays. You'd color the wings of that bird in the direction a bird's wings would go. Certainly you'd color the mountains straight up and down. That's the way that the mountains would go. You see those colors coming down the sides of those mountains. I then colored the leaves in the direction I see each leaf. Many times look at the point, and from the base emanating from that point going that direction. I then see the same thing with the petals of the flower. So I follow these directions in the petal of the flower. I then use a solid fill stitch for the background, followed by the final outline around that entire design. Then we simply end up with the lettering. And if you watch this design run in a view and a slow redraw, and I'll speed it up because it's quite a long design, but you'll see that's absolutely how this design was created. You see the background fill. Now, let me explain something else, and I'm going to stop right here. When one digitizes, there's a basic concept to digitizing. Enter the element, underlay the element based on the top stitch. Always look at the element that it's sitting next to so one can determine the proper distortion values, and then top stitch with the proper start and end point that most benefits the material. You see the direction now in these stitch. You'll now see the mounts coming down. What stitch type? We used an elongated satin stitch in a design like that because elongated satin stitch creates a very natural effect. You then see the birds being done in the direction you would see a bird. You then see the outlines coming down. You then see the border coming around there. Now look at the dimension. You already see in this design right here the dimension coming out. You see the background of that sky behind the rays of those suns. You see the mountains now sitting on top of that element. Understand also that the fill stitch going left to right, followed then by a satin stitch going in a straight up and down in an opposite direction, gives loft to the design. And if you look at every element of this design, we enter the element, we underlay the element, we top stitch the element, always with what it's based on and sitting next to, okay? And that's what I want to talk about next, is I want to talk about the elements of stitches and what they're sitting next to. Because, as I say when I do my classes, embroidery, folks, is nothing more than 3 very simple stitch types: running stitches, satin stitches, and fill stitches, with very simple rules. Rules being that of length, of spacing, of opening size, okay? But embroidery is also combinations of stitches. So what I'd like to key in on next to is in this creation of an embroidery design, and the anatomy of a design, is the combinations of stitches and what it possibly sits next to. So I'm going to open up a series of designs. I'm going to go ahead and let this one finish. But you'll see in this design, again, by creating the elements, background, sun rays, mountains, birds, outline, satin stitch border, leaves, floral. If you were to watch this design run, you would see that pop out. I have now taken those mountains, popped them up against that background sky. I've now taken this flower, popped it up against and in front of those mountains. Look at an embroidery design dimensionally. Look at what is the furthest away from you, and that's the first aspect that you digitize. Then move your way forward in an embroidery design. Now, a couple of the other things. You'll see that in between the lettering here, I have a connection stitch. Well, you know what? That connection stitch in between letters drives me crazy. Why? Because it sticks out like a sore thumb. So if you were to come in and you look in between the lettering, in between that I have in lettering, and I'll zoom into here, and I'll go ahead and generate the needle penetration point. I'm going to turn it off from being 3D. You'll see that in between small letters, I drive a little tiny stitch in between. Number one, when I do small lettering, and what I'm talking about now is lettering spaced from about 0.8 to 1 millimeter apart, which is the normal spacing between small letters. Connect small lettering, folks, with 1 to 2 tiny little running stitches in between. You know what? I'm going to give you a very simple little trick. When I do keyboard lettering, and I have a video out on this, but when I do keyboard lettering, and I'll just go ahead and do my name, Walter. Excuse me, I'm going to do it in caps. And we'll go ahead and make this lettering, excuse me, one more second, 5 millimeters in height. One of the things that drives me crazy with small lettering, let me just move this out of the way 1 second. I've got to go under commands, and I want to turn off the trim in between characters. One of the things that always drives me crazy is the stitch in between small letters. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to zoom in here in between the A and the L. This stitch in between these two letters drive me crazy. They absolutely drive me crazy. Number one, that stitch sticks out like a sore thumb, okay? So in an anatomy of design, one of the first rules my father always taught me in embroidery is best laid in a continuous filament of thread. Two things happen when you connect a letter like this from one letter into the next letter. Number one, if you have not put the proper lock stitch at the end of this letter and step into the next letter, number one, when you go in to trim this, many times this letter A may unravel. Why? If it doesn't have a lock stitch, it's going to unravel. But this stitch shows in between the L and the T. It shows right here. Now, in between the L and the T, first thing I'm going to do is change that spacing a little bit. So I'll come in. Spacing with Floriani software with keyboard lettering is done with the yellow diamond. So I'm going to move that a little closer. But once again, this stitch sticks out like a sore thumb. So here's a little trick, folks, okay? Go into your stitch edit function, which is the fourth icon down on the left, and left click on it. Find the stitch where it moves from the L into the T. Probably that stitch right there. Now, if you have any trouble finding that stitch, go ahead and click on this icon here. This icon are your needle penetration points. Makes it very easy to find that stitch. So I find that stitch. You know what? Right-click on that stitch in Stitch Edit and put Insert Before. Put a stitch right on the end of that letter T and drive 2 to 3 tiny little stitches in between the L and the T. You'll see I have 2 to 3 little needle penetrations. Stitch lengths of 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter in a running stitch in between letters will drive that stitch down into the fabric, and you will not see that stitch. So between the A and the L, find that first stitch where it moves in. It's that stitch right there. Right-click on it, Insert Before. Put a stitch down here, put a stitch on the end of the letter L, drive 1 stitch in between the A and the L. You've just, number 1, eliminated that trim. Those stitches will drive down into the fabrics. You'll never see them again, and you know what? You'll never have to trim those stitches out again. Embroidery, folks, is best laid in a continuous filament of thread. We bring a design up, we size it. Size determines stitch type. We plot it. We plot it again looking at the Columbine logo from back to forward. So we look at a design and we think about it from what we see as the element furthest away, move our way forward. And then we plot a design with a continuous filament of thread being our initial assumption, or the assumption that we want to make. Now, let me explain something else. Underlay within a design. Look, underlay should also be a continuous filament of thread. One of the things that always bothered me, and I'll go ahead and do some keyboard lettering again, and I'll just do a large letter. It doesn't really matter what I do. I'll just do, I'll just go ahead and do my name again. But one of the things that's always bothered me about underlay and auto underlay within a design is that auto underlay many times in a design would leave a break or a gap in between underlay. Again, underlay, and let me explain the rules to underlay. First of all, the stitch length of your underlay. Length equals loft. So when you come in to a design and you look at the underlay, the first rule is proper stitch length. That's why if you come into the running stitch, you'll see that we normally use preset running stitches, even within our letters. When you come in and create a letter A, you're going to see a preset stitch length in that underlay of 2 to 3 millimeters. Why? Because length equals loft. The longer an underlay is, the greater the loft it gives to the top stitch. So the first rule in the underlay underlettering is proper length. Length equals loft. Only when you start laying underlays 2 to 4 millimeters does it give sufficient length. Length equals loft. But then what you want your underlay to be is a continuous filament of thread. And if I come into view in a slow redraw here, and we watch this letter run, you'll see that the way that an auto underlay normally works is it ticks off segments. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and stop that and slow it down. And I'll come through. Look, this is a symptom with auto underlay. It does a segment, and then it starts the top stitch. Then it does a segment, and it starts the top stitch. Look, this is not something, this is controlled by the logic that computer software works. It's an algorithm. So my suggestion when you're working with Floriani software is that when you select that lettering and you go under underlay, the normal underlay that I'm going to use is a center line, and I normally will pick a zigzag stitch. Why? And hit apply. Because a center underlay with a double zigzag stitch, and if you watch the formation of this letter now, forms a continuous underlay through the entire structure. That's an absolute benefit to the embroidery process. Underlay is best laid in a continuous filament of thread by utilizing a single with a double zigzag. Number one, when you're doing small lettering, many times you'll see an underlay pop out from the letter. That's because, once again, we use an elongated stitch. By utilizing a double zigzag, I call it loft and lock. It was a technique I first saw by master German digitizers. Elongated straight underlays followed by a double zigzag give you loft and lock underlays. That's why when I look at a lot of designs, I see a design like this. If I want to optimize the loft of that design, I'm going to come in. I'm going to come down to the lettering on that design. I'm going to select that entire series of letters, and I'm going to come in, and at least I'm going to go ahead and implant a zigzag stitch to that. Why? Loft and lock. I now have a continuous filament of underlay, and if you come in and watch that slow redraw, I just maximize the loft on that design. Underlay is a technique, or is a class I can teach in just itself, but as you'll watch now as it comes into this, I have a straight continuous filament of underlay coming into this now. Okay, and there's your straight underlay. I'll come through and move it one stitch at a time. And now you see a double zigzag. That's loft and lock. That maximizes the loft of that stitch. You know, that lettering will absolutely, like, it looks like it pops up and off the fabric. One of my tricks to small lettering is heavy underlay, lighter top stitch. Now, I am going to go ahead and talk about the combinations of stitches, but I've gone another 15 minutes without even realizing it. Kath, if you've got some more questions, let's go ahead and ask those questions. If not, I'll
absolutely.
Right on with it.
No, we have some questions. The first question is how did you get the software to do slow redraw?
Oh, it's so very simple. When you bring up a design, and I'll go ahead and view the whole thing again. View, zoom, fit the window. First of all, let's talk about the zooming, because you have several different effects. When you go into view and zoom, you have your zoom tool. Now, if you click on zoom tool, you know what? It's like clicking on this zoom icon over here on the far left. Left click on it. Left click and hold. You can go to the top right. Doesn't matter. Left click and hold. You'll pull and grab a box. When you release, it'll zoom into that area. So the first thing that you have in zoom, and I do like to explain this when you zoom in. The zoom tool is just like clicking that little zoom icon over here on the left. So you click on zoom tool, excuse me, the zoom tool. You'll come in, zoom, and it'll put in. Now, when you go under zoom and you hit zoom in, it zooms in. If you see up here, I'm 934%.
Get close to your microphone.
Excuse me, zoom in, 869, okay? Left click again, it's going to zoom in, 3,700. So zooming in zooms in 100% each time. Same thing with zooming out. Zoom out, okay? Zoom out, 100% each time. If you hit zoom to fit, it zooms to the entire design. Now, one neat thing, and I use it an awful lot, I'll come in and use my selection tool, select any aspect of the design, even those running stitches in that letter C, and click zoom to selection, okay? And it selects right to that area that you've selected. Now, for a slow redraw, very, very simple. Once again, view, zoom to fit. It's going to fit the window. View, slow redraw. Now, let me explain. Here's your speed tool over here. This will speed it up. Going left will slow it down. This tool right here will actually go one stitch at a time. And look, this can be very, very helpful in learning how a digitizer digitizes the design. This tool here, or this icon here, I've slowed it down all the way. We'll simulate it and move it forward. The center icon will pause it. The left icon will take you backwards through a design. So you can not only move forward, you can move backwards, you can also move one stitch at a time throughout a design. Now, though, Kath, let me explain something. I have stated for years, and as I give my classes, I tell people that I was pretty fortunate. Look, I do know a lot about the embroidery process, but understand, folks, I sat next to an embroidery master. My father was an embroidery master. As difficult as ever learning this embroidery process was for me, and I always say in my classes, was turning to my left or my right saying, hey, Dad, what the heck's going on here? My father always had the same answer. Oh, you knucklehead, how many times do I have to tell you? I always say in the class, too, you know what? I was 18 years old before I realized my middle name wasn't Knucklehead. But I did get to sit next to a master digitizer. And I said for years that very few of you will have the ability that I had, the ability to sit next to a master digitizer and have that kind of simplicity brought on upon oneself in learning the process. Well, you know what? I apologize, folks. I was wrong. The fact is that, look, we all own designs we love to run. And we all own designs we hope to God we never put on an embroidery machine again. Well, I hope as you learn from me over time, not only through this anatomy, but through this entire process, that if you own a master's work, you know what that master knows. And I'd like to show you a very simple example. What my book is about, folks, and what my software is about a process, a theory I developed years ago called the measurement theory of embroidery creation. I realized 11 years ago that embroidery was measurable. So here's a very simple lettering design, okay? Now, let's say you ran this embroidery design and you said to yourself, well, that Floriani guy isn't that pretty, but he sure seems to know his embroidery. I'd love to sit next to Walter Floriani and learn how he digitizes. Well, you know what? If you own my designs, okay, if you own one of my designs, you can learn what I know in that design. And let me show you what I'm talking about. You run a lettering design like this. What does this have to do with an anatomy of design? Because a master's work reflects everything that master knows. So you have a design and you run this design and you go, my gosh, that's the finest lettering I've ever run in my life. I want all my lettering to look just like that. Well, you know what you have to know, folks? You have to know, number one, you see the stitches underneath the top stitches. Those are my underlay. Underlay are done with running stitch. You know what I have to know about my running stitch, or you have to know? You have to know the stitch lengths. You know what you do? Come to this icon right down here again, stitch ends, and mark them. These are now needle penetration points. It's throwing you every place I've dropped the stitch in that design. Simply grab the ruler in that design, or grab that ruler right over here on the far left. Measure from one stitch down to the next stitch along that line. And you see how that's 3 millimeters, folks? You know what that is? That's my stitch length of my running stitch. So you know what you do? You go into the running stitch on the software, set your stitch length to 3 millimeters. Oh, look at that. Floriani software has already set to 3 millimeters. Why? Because length equals loft with a running stitch. The preset lengths and densities on my software are based on how I've digitized all my life. So you've just duplicated my running stitch length. Now, you feel of that lettering, and you go, oh my gosh, that lettering feels like butter. It's soft like butter. I want all my lettering to feel like butter. Well, you know what you have to know now, folks? You have to know my density. Watch how simple density is to learn how to determine with Floriani software. Simply grab the ruler. Now, let me explain something. I'm teaching you to read a design of a stock embroidery design. If you own a design in our C2S format, the secret is in the Pro Properties box, and I'll show you that in a minute. But here's a design digitized on another piece of software. Yet you already know the stitch length I used in running stitch. Now you need to know my density. Well, you know what? Come along the edge of any straight line of stitching and simply measure from one stitch down to the next. You see how that says 0.5, folks? That's the density that I use within this design. So you know what you do? You go into SAT stitching and set your density to 0.5. Well, look at that. Floriani software is already preset to 0.5. In fact, Floriani software, the preset densities are set 10 to 20% less than almost any other software in the industry. Software, for the most part in this industry, propagates bulletproof embroidery. The densities are set too heavy. We've set the densities lighter within the software. So now you know my SAT stitch density. So now you know two of the factors of how I digitize. You know my stitch length, you know my stitch density. Well, you know what you have to know? Now you've got to sit next to me. You've got to watch me digitize, folks. That's the value of view and slow redraw. You can actually go through this design one stitch at a time, or you can watch it slow redraw multiple times. You know what you're watching me do now, folks? You're watching me digitize. For God's sakes, you saw where I started, the underlay, how I moved through the design with the underlay. how I then started the top stitch, and how I progressed through the design. You're watching me digitize. In fact, you know what you're watching? You just all sat next to Walt Floriani. Same stitch length, same density, and now you're watching what I simply call the pathing of a master. You're watching me digitize. You see how my underlay is a continuous filament of thread throughout the entire process. You see how I angle in and angle out of the corners, softening the corners of that embroidery design. Well, you know what you do to learn this process now? And I'll tell you how I learned this. I had a lace design. One of my favorite lace makers in the world is Urban Sunt, Sunt embroidery design. And I brought one of his designs up, and I watched his design run on my embroidery machine. And I said to myself some years back, my gosh, I wish I had the opportunity to sit next to this young man for a day, a half a day. I could reteach myself lace making. I hadn't stitched lace in probably 20 or 30 years. Well, you know what then it hit me to do was to utilize my measurement theory. I simply measured his stitch lengths. I measured his densities. I set my running stitch length to the same length he set his. I measured his densities. I set my satin stitch density to the same density. I watched it slow redraw. I saw that with his underlay, he did a continuous 4 to 7 revolutions of run stitch underneath the top stitch. Saw where he started the satin stitch, saw where he ended it. You know what you do now, and one of the magnificent aspects about Floriani software as a learning curve, you leave that design on the screen. Down here in the color bar, you'll see I have one color. Come over here to this plus sign and add another color. You know what, at this point, grab your running stitch, okay? Right on top of my design now, you watched it slow redraw, excuse me. Go ahead and right-click on that secondary color, grab your running stitch. Right on top of that design, stitch, okay? What you actually are doing right now, following the stitches, you know what? You're not only following the exact path of my underlay, you've duplicated, and what I've done right here in about 10 seconds is I've duplicated my own underlay right down to the stitch length. Then go into your satin stitch. You know what? I laid a manual underlay, so I'm going to turn off the underlay. But then I grabbed my satin stitch, and if you watch this design run, you'd see that this design was digitized just like this. You know what you just did, folks, or what I just did with myself here? I just sat next to myself. You just sat next to Walter Floriani. You measure stitch length. You measure density. You watch it slow redraw. You know what I was done? I actually did that on top of a Zoot design. When I was done in 30 minutes, I deleted his and I ran mine. For gosh sakes, I was so proud of myself, I walked around for 3 days calling myself Walter's son. I retaught myself lace making. Once you learn to measure an embroidery design, you measure length, you measure density, you watch it slow redraw. Talk about anatomy of a design. Let a master's work teach you that master's work. It will teach you simply by measuring stitch length, stitch density. Watching it slow redraw teaches you the pathing of a master. I hope you all realize the world that opens up to you. If you own a master's work, there are no secrets. You can teach yourself lace making, blending, bleeding, feathering, fringing. There are no secrets in this embroidery process. I got something else I want to share with them, Kat, but I'm going to open it up to questions. Yeah.
Okay. How do you change from standard digitizing mode to advanced digitizing mode?
Very simple, and let me explain the difference. Under Tools and General Options, you have a digitizing tab. If you click on that digitizing tab in both complex fill and satin stitch, you have both advanced and standard. Let me explain the difference. If you're in the standard mode of a complex fill, you'll lay that fill stitch again with a series of left clicks. When you right-click to normally finish the sequence, in standard, it will finish the sequence. Now, if you select that element and you go into shape, the third icon down on the left, the software, and if you look under Tools and General Options under Digitizing and Standard, I've set a default angle to 0. It's going to lay all my fill stitches at a 0-degree angle, okay? But the software is also now determining start points and end points. Now, I digitize a lot standard. Why? Because it's very, very quick. Let me explain. Go into Tools, General Options, said digitizing to advanced level of digitizing with a fill stitch. I now outline, excuse me, let me grab my fill. I outline that same structure of fill, but now I right-click and it's going to ask me angle. I now put in my angle. Then it's going to ask me start point, put it where I want. Then it's going to ask me end point, left-click and put it where I want, and it will generate the stitches. Very, very functional. I tend to work in standard. Why? Because I can very easily select that first element. Come to the third icon down on the left shape. Well, moving start points is no more than grabbing that green dot, putting it where you want, grabbing the red diamond, putting it where you want, grabbing the angle, turning it to what you want, right-clicking. The software is so adept at editing. I find that standard digitizing is a very, very, very quick aspect, and I like standard. Because I can move start point, end point, and angle so quickly, I work within the fill stitch, certainly, with standard a lot. Now, I tend to very much feel the same way about satin stitching, and I'll show you exactly why. When you're doing a satin stitch, and I'm going to come in, and let me go ahead and change my fill stitch back.
Stay close to the mic.
You know what? I should have showed initially the standard version of satin stitching. When you're in a standard version of satin stitching, and we'll come in, and you have two different types of satin stitching with Floriani software, what we call input satin path and classic satin. The input satin path, basically if I were doing a letter I, or let's say a letter L, I left-click, or let's say a letter I, the left side of the letter I then right-click to go over to the right side, I left-click again on the top right, and then I right-click and generates the stitches. If I'm in the classic satin stitch is what we call point counterpoint. So now I left-click on the, let's say, top right of the letter I, left-click on the top left, left-click on the center right, left-click on the center left, left-click on the bottom right, left-click on the center left. Now, why do I give you those two types of satin stitching? Because the initial logic built in the software, those of you who've seen my class understand that one of the reasons that we bird nest in embroidery is based on how we go around the corner. An example, if I'm in a classic satin stitch and I left-click, or excuse me, right-click over there, or excuse me, left-click but on the far right side of the letter L, and I'm going to make a letter L, left-click here, I left-click here, left-click here. Now I go into my curve, left-click and into the curve, and then we left-click, and then we left-click and right-click. What I've actually formed here is actually what causes bird nesting. This is what we call a hard corner. I've come from a straight element of stitching into a curve, back into a straight element of stitching. I'm forcing the same amount of stitching from here to here as I have from here to here. Well, you know what? The input satin path, that's how it used to do a letter L. So we developed the classic satin because in a classic satin you can do something that I simply call angle in and angle out. I'm going to go ahead and utilize my grid now. But when I would do and utilize the classic satin, I would now left-click, left-click. But now as I come into the curve, I left-click and I start to throw it at the angle of the curve. Why? Because the best way to angle an embroidery is something that I call angle in and angle out. And then we'll come back to a straight. Well, now what I have is a very open corner. This stops bird nesting. Well, our input satin path used to do it in what I call the hard corner. But watch what we did to a satin path. We utilized a technique that we simply call fractional spacing. So now if you do a letter L with the input satin path, I'm simply going to do this entire side of the letter L. I right-click to get to the other side, left-click again, left-click up here, and then right-click. You see how beautiful it now angles in and out? It's because the way that we decided, or the way that we make a turn in our input satin path is based on what I call fractional spacing. It's trying to maintain the same space here as it does here. That forces an angle in and an angle out of the corner. Folks, that's what causes bird nesting, is hard angles. Floriani software absolutely in inputting or utilizing the input satin path forces the proper angle in. Once again, you know what? This software is based on the reality of embroidery creation. Proper angles, proper width, proper overlaps. That's what Safety Sew is about, the overlap distortion values in here. Let's open up to another question, and I'm going to quickly end up with the overlaps in embroidery, Cap.
Okay, I have a question about how to set for a split satin stitch.
A split satin stitch? A split satin stitch, you just, as you come in, and I'm going to utilize the grid, okay, and zoom in a little bit more. You know what? Why I utilize the grid, folks, is the grid for me, and those of you who've seen me in a class understand that the narrowest satin stitch width in embroidery is 1.4 millimeters. So I utilize and set my grid to 1.4 millimeters. Why? It's a frame of reference. If I've zoomed in to a design, and I've zoomed in this much now, and I'm digitizing satin stitch, what I have behind me is a frame of reference. Never make your satin stitching narrower than the box behind you. That's the value of a grid. But in splitting a satin stitch, and I say in my book that a satin stitch can grow to about 8 millimeters or so before it needs to become a fill stitch. So if I utilize the grid, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or so grids, let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit. 6 or so grids is going to give me about 8 millimeters. So if I go into my satin stitching and I left click here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, I'm over the maximum length of the width of a satin stitch. So if I generate that as a satin stitch, absolutely. As I come in and generate the needle penetrations, I've got stitch length. But you know what? At this point, and this is one handy tip with scaling a design. As you scale a design up in size, always look at the widest satin stitch in that embroidery design. Take it up to any size you want, but you know what? Grab your ruler after you've regenerated it and measure its width. You see right there, it's telling me I should actually use a fill stitch. So one of the great things about Floriani software is you can select it and turn that satin stitch, you know what, into a fill stitch. Tommy is the Japanese vernacular for fill. Click apply, and you just made that satin a fill. But what you're alluding to, Kathy, and I'll go ahead and turn that back into a satin, okay, is splitting that satin stitch. And that is done here under the command of, it's done under the general command, one more, column, okay? And you can say split that satin stitch, and you can say absolute, or you can say by percentage. So if you say, let's say percentage, and you tell it 50% and hit apply, it's going to drop a stitch directly in the center of that satin. So it's going to drop a stitch, going to drop a stitch, going to drop a stitch. Then on the way back over, it's going to drop another stitch. Look, the only reason we'll utilize a split satin, and I'll show you an example exactly when I'm going to utilize a split satin, is sometimes to create an effect. When I'm creating like a leaf design, and I come in and I want to make a satin stitch, and I'll grab and I'm going to come in and left click here. Well, one of the first things that I see in a leaf, and I'm sorry, I should have made this a curved satin, but it's all right. Okay, is that along a leaf you see the center stem of a leaf. So I will select that satin stitch. I'll come under column and I'll say split that satin stitch at 50% and click apply. You know what I just formed? I just formed the stem or the seam to a leaf. Why? Because down the center of a leaf you'll drop that needle penetration. That actually causes an effect. Again, stitch type creates the effect. Elongated satin stitch creates the effect of a leaf. Stitch direction and the dropping of the stitches in the center of that creates the effect, which would be the seam of the leaf. I hope that's helpful. Another question?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we better move on, Walt, because we're at 7:15. So
I can't help myself.
I know, but now you can
finish
up now.
In this anatomy of a design is that I want you to understand embroidery from this point on, again, as 3 stitch types, running, satin, and fill. But embroidery is also combinations of stitches. And in 100% of embroidery, folks, there's only 6 possible combinations of stitches. I'm going to open up those combinations of stitches for you right now. In 100% of the embroidery process, folks, what we have is we have, I'll open them up right now. What you have in embroidery, folks, are fill stitches next to fill stitches, okay? Let me go ahead and drop the needle penetration points. And let me go ahead and open up. You know what? I have to just delete a few of these designs, Kath. Let's go ahead and open up 6A. You see how I did that? Let me explain something. When you have a bunch of designs open up here, see this little down arrow here on the right? These are active files. I wanted to open up 6A. Right-click on that, and if you got a bunch of files open up, you'll see them all listed there. What you have here are, these are fill stitches next to other fill stitches. In embroidery, we have fill stitches next to fill stitches. We have fill stitches next to satin stitches. We have fill stitches next to running stitches. We have satin stitches next to satin stitches. We have satin stitches next to running stitches. And we have running stitches next to other running stitches. In 100% of embroidery, and I will prove to any of you, if you look at any design, it's composed of one or all 6 of those combinations of stitches. Well, you know what? The combinations of stitches, 5 of them, and I'm going to go very quickly, have rules of overlapping. When you digitize, if you put a fill stitch next to another fill stitch, folks, one fill stitch in the direction of the stitch that it goes needs to overlap into the other. The minimal overlap of a fill next to a fill, folks, is 1 millimeter or more. If you overlap a fill stitch into another fill stitch a millimeter or more, you'll never get separation in between the 2 stitches. I'm going to ramble through these very quickly. When you put a fill stitch next to a satin stitch, there's a rule of an overlap. When you put a fill next to a satin, that fill needs to overlap into that satin stitch, once again, 1 millimeter or more, okay? I'll explain the credence of this in just a second. When you put a fill stitch next to a running stitch, the fill stitch needs to overlap that running stitch 5/10 of a millimeter. When you put a satin stitch next to a satin stitch, the one satin needs to overlap into the other satin 1 millimeter or more. And when you put a satin stitch next to a running stitch, that satin stitch needs to go outside of that running stitch 2 to 3/10 of a millimeter. Look, let me explain something, and I am so serious about this, folks. 85% of embroidery is nothing more than proper widths. Those are satin stitch widths of 1.4 or greater. Proper angles, what I showed you in the letter L, angle in and an angle out. And then proper overlaps. You've all seen background separate from outline. You look at any design where the background separated from the outline, and it simply is telling you the digitizer did not overlap into the other stitch type enough. Embroidery is nothing more. Stop looking at an embroidery design as a design. Look at an embroidery design. You bring it up onto the software, okay? So you bring any design up onto Floriani software. I don't care what it is. You bring it up onto the design or up onto the screen, and you size that design. After that design is sized, you grab the ruler, and you simply come in and measure with determined stitch type. So here I have a fill stitch. Well, you know what? It's sitting next to a satin stitch. My contention is that a fill stitch next to a satin stitch is always a fill stitch next to a satin stitch. It has a rule. That rule is an overlap of a millimeter or more. You see, folks, stop looking at designs as designs. It's what is the stitch type and what the blesses it's sitting next to. Once you learn how to put one stitch type next to another stitch type correctly, it's always that stitch type next to that next stitch type. And there are only 5 combinations of stitches with rules of overlap. It so simplifies embroidery creation. I hope you all understand this. I have loved this evening. I just want to keep going on and on. Kath, if you have any last-minute questions, I'll take them. If not, I love you all. Hugs and stitches to you. I hope this has been worthwhile. Enjoy your software. I look forward to talking to you again next time.
Walter, I think that's good. I think we are out of questions because we are definitely out of time. So I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to thank our wonderful moderators. I want to thank our tech support team that does such a good job. And I also want to thank DJ Anderson, who's working on recording these. We did have several questions asking, were we going to record these webinars and make them available? We are trying to do that now because that would make it so much easier, especially for people that cannot attend. So we are working on that, and I just want to thank mostly all of y'all for coming tonight. Because
Kathy,
without
can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You know what? I'd like to explain to people one minute why recording has been somewhat of an issue. What sometimes the student out there doesn't understand is that many times, and I'm not sure where you are right now, Miss Kathy, but you might be in Seattle, honey. And I've done one of these from an airplane, and DJ Anderson is sitting in an office in, let's say, Knoxville, Tennessee. One of the issues has been where we're all sitting and where we're all calling in from. It's not that we haven't wanted to record it. Sometimes it's the issue of where we all are. We all are out giving speeches trying to teach this industry, and that's been one of the issues, and we're doing everything we can to overcome that. And I agree with you. And I apologize that I didn't. I want to thank every panelist. I want to thank DJ Kathy. I want to thank you so much. I love you all so much. Floriani software and our efforts and what we're trying to do educationally would not be what it is without all of you. And I thank you all from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Walter, and we thank you so much for all your knowledge and to share it with all of us so we can digitize like a master. Have a wonderful night. If you still have questions that are not answered, do not worry. We will get to all your questions. We want to thank all of you for coming. And we look forward to seeing you next time because you will be sewing with the masters in no time.